Margaret Chen sat in her worn leather armchair, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she held the cup of jasmine tea that had grown cold hours ago. At 73, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered countless storms, though recent months had carved deeper lines around her gentle brown eyes. Her silver hair, always neatly pinned back in a modest bun, framed a face that had once been quick to smile, but now wore the weight of profound disappointment. For 45 years, Margaret had been the cornerstone of her family. After immigrating from Taiwan in her 20s, she had worked tirelessly as a seamstress in a small textile factory while raising 3 children as a single mother. Her husband had passed away when their youngest was only 8, leaving her to navigate the challenges of parenthood, work, and survival in a country that still felt foreign, despite the decades she'd called it home. Margaret's life had been a testament to sacrifice. She had sewn clothes late into the night to pay for her children's school supplies, skipped meals to ensure they had enough to eat, and worked double shifts to save for their college educations. When her eldest son, David, struggled to find his footing after graduation, she had welcomed him and his new wife, Linda, into her home, the same modest 3-bedroom house she had purchased with her life savings 30 years earlier. David, now 45, worked in middle management at a tech company, earning a comfortable salary but never quite enough to satisfy his wife's expensive tastes. Linda, a sharp-tongued woman in her early 40s, had grown accustomed to the conveniences that came with living in Margaret's fully paid home. Their 2 teenage children, Kevin and Sarah, had inherited their mother's sense of entitlement, treating their grandmother's house as their personal domain while showing little respect for the woman who had made their comfortable lifestyle possible. The house that Margaret had called home for 3 decades had gradually transformed into something unrecognizable. What had once been her sanctuary now felt like a prison where she was merely tolerated rather than honored. Her son, who had once been her pride and joy, now barely acknowledged her presence unless he needed something. Linda treated her like an inconvenient burden, rolling her eyes whenever Margaret spoke, and making snide comments about old people, loud enough for her to hear. The breaking point had come 3 days earlier, during what should have been a celebration of Margaret's 73rd birthday. Instead of the quiet family dinner she had hoped for, the evening had devolved into a cruel display of indifference and disrespect that had shattered something deep within her heart. The words still echoed in her mind, each syllable a fresh wound that refused to heal. As Margaret sat in the growing darkness of her living room, surrounded by the photographs and memories of a life spent giving everything to ungrateful recipients, she found herself asking a question that would change everything. How had the woman who had built this family from nothing become so worthless in their eyes? Margaret's relationship with her family hadn't always been strained. In the early years after David and Linda moved in, there had been moments of genuine warmth and connection. She had been overjoyed to help raise her grandchildren, teaching them traditional Chinese recipes and sharing stories of their heritage. David had seemed genuinely grateful for his mother's support, often praising her cooking and thanking her for providing them with a stable home while they saved for their own place. Those early promises of temporary arrangements had gradually faded into permanent expectations. What was supposed to be a 2-year stay had stretched into 8 years, with no signs of the family making any real effort to become independent. Margaret had never complained, believing that family came first and that her sacrifices were simply part of being a good mother and grandmother. Over the years, Margaret had given far more than just housing. When Linda was laid off from her marketing job, Margaret had dipped into her retirement savings to help cover the family's expenses for 6 months. When Kevin needed expensive orthodontic work, she had paid the full cost without hesitation. When Sarah wanted to attend a prestigious summer program, Margaret had worked extra hours at the local dry cleaner, where she had taken a part-time job to stay active, just to afford the fees. Her generosity extended beyond financial support. Margaret had been the family's primary caregiver, cooking elaborate meals every evening, maintaining the household, and providing free childcare whenever David and Linda wanted to go out. She had nursed them through illnesses, celebrated their achievements, and offered comfort during their disappointments. Her love had been unconditional, her support unwavering. Yet somewhere along the way, her family's gratitude had transformed into expectation, and expectation had curdled into resentment. Linda had begun to view Margaret's presence as an intrusion, rather than a blessing. She complained to her friends about having to live with her controlling mother-in-law, conveniently forgetting that it was Margaret's house they lived in rent-free. David, caught between his wife's complaints and his mother's feelings, had chosen the path of least resistance, gradually distancing himself from the woman who had sacrificed everything for his success. The shift had been gradual but unmistakable. Family dinners became rushed affairs where Margaret ate alone while the others scattered to their rooms. Her opinions were dismissed or ignored entirely. Her traditions and customs were mocked as outdated and irrelevant. The grandchildren she had helped raise now barely looked up from their phones when she spoke, treating her like furniture rather than family. The final straw had been building for months. Linda had grown increasingly bold in her disrespect, making comments about Margaret being in the way and too old to understand how things work now. David had stopped defending his mother entirely, sometimes even joining in his wife's criticism to avoid conflict at home. The house that Margaret owned, maintained, and filled with love had become a place where she felt like an unwelcome guest. The DUIM's evening of Margaret's 73rd birthday began with the kind of hope that only comes from a lifetime of choosing optimism over bitterness. She had spent the afternoon preparing her famous dumplings and spring rolls, the same dishes that had once brought her family together around the dining table with laughter and stories. The dining room was set with her best china, the table decorated, with a small bouquet of flowers she had picked from her own garden. As the family gathered for dinner, Margaret's heart swelled with the familiar warmth of having her loved ones near. She had prepared David's favorite soup, made Linda's preferred vegetables, and even baked a special cake for the grandchildren. In her mind, this was going to be the evening that reminded everyone why family mattered, why the bonds they shared were worth preserving. The conversation started pleasantly enough, with Margaret sharing a funny story from her afternoon at the Yazzie community garden where she volunteered. But as the meal progressed, the atmosphere began to shift. Linda kept checking her phone, barely touching the food that Margaret had spent hours preparing. Kevin and Sarah were more interested in their devices than in their grandmother's stories, responding with monosyllabic grunts when she tried to engage them in conversation. When Margaret gently suggested they put their phones away for the birthday dinner, Linda's patience finally snapped. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Mom," she said, using the title with obvious sarcasm. "Not everyone wants to listen to your boring stories about the old days. We have our own lives to live." David, instead of defending his mother, simply shrugged and muttered, "She's right, Ma. Times are different now. You need to understand that." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, but she tried to maintain her composure. "I just thought we could have a nice family dinner," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's my birthday." "And we're here, aren't we?" Linda snapped back, her voice rising with irritation. "What more do you want? We've been putting up with your constant need for attention for years. Honestly, sometimes I think you forget whose house this really is." Margaret felt her blood run cold. "This is my house, Linda. I bought it with my own money, and I've been letting you live here because you're family." Linda's laugh was sharp and cruel. "Your house? Please. You're 73 years old and can barely take care of yourself. You're lucky we're here to help you, not the other way around. Without us, you'd be completely useless and alone." The words hung in the air like poison. Kevin and Sarah continued to stare at their phones, seemingly oblivious to the cruelty unfolding before them. David avoided his mother's eyes, his silence speaking volumes about where his loyalties lay. Margaret's hands began to shake as the full weight of the disrespect hit her. This wasn't just about one harsh comment or a moment of frustration. This was about years of accumulated resentment, ingratitude, and a fundamental lack of respect for everything she had done and continued to do for this family. Useless, she repeated softly, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. You think I'm useless? Linda rolled her eyes dramatically. If the shoe fits, you contribute nothing to this household except complaints and old-fashioned ideas that nobody cares about anymore. Maybe it's time you accepted that your time has passed. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret looked around the table at the faces of the people she had loved and sacrificed for, searching for even a hint of remorse or recognition of how deeply they had wounded her. She found nothing but indifference and, in Linda's case, satisfied cruelty. Rising slowly from her chair, Margaret's voice was steady despite the tears threatening to fall. I see, she said simply. I understand now. As she walked toward her bedroom, she could hear Linda's voice behind her, complaining to David about old people being too sensitive and how they couldn't handle modern life. Margaret closed her door quietly, sat on the edge of her bed, and for the first time in decades allowed herself to cry, not from sadness, but from a clarity that was both liberating and terrifying. In the solitude of her bedroom, Margaret sat, surrounded by the photographs and mementos of a life dedicated to others. The tears had stopped, replaced by something far more powerful, a crystal-clear understanding of her worth and her rights. For too long, she had allowed love to blind her to the reality that her family saw her as nothing more than a convenient provider of free housing and services. The word useless echoed in her mind, but instead of causing more pain, it sparked something that had been dormant for years: righteous anger. Margaret had built a life from nothing, raised 3 successful children as a single mother, and created a home that had sheltered and nurtured multiple generations. She was many things, but useless was not one of them. That night, she barely slept. Instead, she lay in bed mentally cataloging everything she had given and everything she had received in return. The math was stark and undeniable. She had provided a home, financial support, childcare, household management, and unconditional love. In return, she had received ingratitude, disrespect, and the clear message that her presence was tolerated, rather than valued. By morning, Margaret had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. She was going to reclaim her dignity, her home, and her life. The family that had called her useless was about to discover just how much they had depended on the woman they had taken for granted. Her first stop was the local legal aid office, where she met with Mrs. Patterson, a kind but efficient attorney who specialized in elder law and family issues. Margaret explained her situation with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout years of mistreatment. Mrs. Chen, Mrs. Patterson said after hearing the full story, you have every legal right to ask them to leave. This is your home, and they are essentially guests who have overstayed their welcome. You don't need anyone's permission to reclaim your own property. The attorney explained the formal eviction process, which would give the family 30 days to find alternative housing. Margaret also learned about her rights as a homeowner and the legal protections available to prevent elder abuse, which, Mrs. Patterson gently explained, included the emotional and financial exploitation Margaret had been enduring. But they're my family, Margaret said, voicing the concern that had kept her trapped for so long. Family doesn't give anyone the right to abuse or take advantage of you, Mrs. Patterson replied firmly. Respect and love should flow both ways, especially when you're the one providing the home and support. Margaret spent the next week gathering documents, property deeds, bank statements, and records of all the financial support she had provided. Over the years, the numbers were staggering. Between free housing, direct financial gifts, and unpaid household services, She had provided well over $200,000 in value to her son's family over the past 8 years. She also made some practical preparations. Margaret contacted a locksmith to arrange for new locks to be installed, researched storage facilities in case her family needed help moving their belongings, and even found information about apartments that might be suitable for David's family to rent. The hardest part was emotional preparation. Margaret spent hours in her garden, the one place that had remained truly hers throughout the years of gradual invasion. Among the roses and vegetables she had planted and tended, she found the strength to acknowledge a painful truth. Sometimes love requires boundaries, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's disrespectful behavior. On the morning she planned to serve the eviction notice, Margaret stood in front of her bedroom mirror and saw something she hadn't seen in years: a woman who knew her own worth. The scared, hurt person who had been called useless was gone, replaced by someone who understood that being kind didn't mean being a doormat, and being family didn't mean accepting abuse. Margaret chose a Friday evening to deliver the news, timing it deliberately so that David and Linda would have the weekend to process the information before making any rash decisions. She had prepared carefully, laying out all the legal documents on the dining room table, the same table where she had been humiliated on her birthday just 2 weeks earlier. When the family gathered for what they assumed would be another routine dinner, they found Margaret standing beside the formally set table, dressed in her best navy blue dress and wearing the pearl necklace her late husband had given her for their anniversary. Her bearing was dignified, almost regal, and something in her demeanor immediately commanded attention. "I need to speak with all of you," she said, her voice calm but carrying an authority that none of them had heard before. "Please sit down." Linda rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed at being interrupted from her phone conversation. "What's this?" "About, Mom? Can't it wait? I have plans tonight." "No, it cannot wait," Margaret replied evenly. "This concerns the future of everyone in this room." As the family reluctantly took their seats, Margaret remained standing. She had rehearsed this moment, but now that it was here, she felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. 2 weeks ago, on my birthday, I was told that I was useless, and that my time had passed, she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to say. "I've had time to reflect on those words, and I realize that you're right about one thing. It is time for some changes." She picked up the official eviction notice and placed it in the center of the table. "I am formally asking you to find alternative housing within 30 days. This is my home, which I purchased with my own money and have maintained with my own efforts. I will no longer allow it to be taken for granted or used as a free resource by people who view me as a burden." The silence that followed was so complete that Margaret could hear the wall clock ticking. David was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, what are you talking about? This is our home too. We've lived here for 8 years. "You've lived here as my guests," Margaret corrected firmly. "Guests who have never paid rent, never contributed to mortgage payments, utilities, or maintenance, and who have made it clear that my presence is unwelcome in my own home." Linda's face had gone pale, then flushed red with anger. "You can't be serious. You can't just throw us out. We have children. We have nowhere to go." "You have 30 days to find somewhere to go," Margaret replied, her tone never wavering. "The same amount of time the law requires, and more consideration than was shown to me when I was called useless in my own dining room." "Grandma, you can't do this to us," Sarah said, finally looking up from her phone with genuine alarm. "Where are we supposed to live?" Margaret felt a pang of sadness for her grandchildren, but she had prepared for this moment. "Your parents are both employed. Adults who have been saving money for 8 years by not paying housing costs. They have the resources to find appropriate housing for your family." David's shock was giving way to panic. "Mom, please, let's talk about this. If we've been thoughtless or said things we shouldn't have, we can work it out. You don't have to. Do something this drastic. Thoughtless, Margaret's voice carried a note of steel. David? Your wife called me useless to my face on my birthday, and you said nothing. For months, I've been treated like an unwelcome burden in the home I've provided for your family. This isn't about one thoughtless comment. This is about years of disrespect and taking advantage of my generosity. Linda's temper finally exploded. This is insane. You're just a bitter old woman who can't handle the fact that the world doesn't revolve around you anymore. You need us more than we need you. We'll see about that, Margaret said quietly, her composure unshaken by Linda's outburst. You have until the end of the month to make other arrangements. I've already spoken with an attorney, and everything is being done according to the law. The room erupted in chaos. Linda was shouting about the unfairness of it all. David was pleading for reconsideration, and the children were demanding to know what this meant for their lives. Through it all, Margaret remained calm and resolute. The decision is final, she said when the noise finally died down. I will not be changing my mind. You've made it clear that I'm useless and in the way. Now you'll have the opportunity to prove how little you actually need me. As the family dispersed in various states of anger and disbelief, Margaret began clearing the legal documents from the table. For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace in her own home. The 30-day period that followed was a masterclass in consequence and revelation. What Margaret's family had failed to realize during their years of taking her for granted was just how much their comfortable lifestyle had depended on the woman they had dismissed as useless. The first shock came when David and Linda began searching for rental properties. Having lived rent-free for 8 years, they had grown accustomed to a standard of living that their actual income couldn't support. The homes that fit their budget were significantly smaller and in less desirable neighborhoods than the spacious, well-maintained house they had considered their own. Do you know what rent costs these days? Linda complained to David after their third disappointing apartment viewing. We can't afford anything decent. Your mother is being completely unreasonable. But the financial reality was just the beginning. Without Margaret's daily contributions, the family quickly realized how much unpaid labor she had been providing. There was no one to cook the elaborate meals they had grown accustomed to, no one to maintain the household organization that had made their lives run smoothly, and no one to provide the childcare that had allowed David and Linda to work late or go out whenever they pleased. Linda, who had never learned to cook more than basic meals, found herself struggling to feed the family. The children complained about the takeout meals and frozen dinners that replaced Margaret's home-cooked food. David, who had never paid attention to household management, was overwhelmed by the logistics of moving and finding a new place to live while maintaining his work responsibilities. By the third week, desperation had set in. David approached his mother with tears in his eyes, a sight that might have moved her just months earlier. Mom, I'm begging you to reconsider, he pleaded. I know we haven't always appreciated everything you do, but you're family. We're family. We can work this out. Margaret, who was watering her garden in the peaceful afternoon sun, looked at her son with a mixture of sadness and resolve. David, when you stood by and said nothing while your wife called me useless, you made a choice about what kind of family we are. When you allowed me to be disrespected in my own home for months, you showed me exactly how much this family relationship means to you. But I didn't mean it like that, David protested. You know I love you. We all do. Love is not just a feeling, David. It's a choice you make every day through your actions and words. For years, your actions have shown me that I'm valuable, only for what I can provide, not for who I am. Linda, swallowing her pride, even attempted her own apology. Margaret, I'm sorry about what I said on your birthday. I was stressed and said things I didn't mean. Can't we put this behind us and move forward? Margaret's response was measured and calm. Linda, you didn't accidentally hurt my feelings. You expressed what you truly believe about my value, and place in this family. The only thing you regret is that there are consequences for your words and actions. The children, facing the reality of leaving the only home they remembered, made their own desperate pleas. "Grandma, we're sorry if we were disrespectful," Kevin said. "We didn't realize you were serious about kicking us out." Sarah, with tears streaming down her face, added, "Please don't make us leave. We promise we'll be better. We'll help more around the house and spend more time with you." Margaret's heart ached for her grandchildren, but she had learned a crucial lesson about enabling behavior. "I love you both very much," she told them gently. "But loving someone doesn't mean accepting disrespectful treatment. Your parents need to learn how to provide for you properly, and you need to learn what it means to appreciate the people who care for you." As the final days of the 30-day period approached, the family's attempts at reconciliation became increasingly frantic. David offered to pay rent going forward, Linda promised to be more respectful, and the children vowed to change their attitudes. But Margaret had made her decision based on years of experience, not on last-minute promises made under duress. "You had 8 years to show appreciation and respect," she told them firmly. 8 years to treat me like family instead of like a service provider. These promises come only now that you're facing consequences for your choices." On the morning of the 30th day, as a moving truck pulled up to the house, Margaret watched from her kitchen window as her family loaded their belongings. The children were crying, Linda was angry and silent, and David kept looking back at the house with an expression of profound regret. But Margaret felt no satisfaction in their distress, only a deep sense of rightness. She had finally chosen herself, her dignity, and her peace over the comfortable misery of being taken for granted. 6 months after reclaiming her home, Margaret barely recognized her own life. The house that had once felt like a prison now truly felt like a sanctuary again. She had redecorated the rooms that had been taken over by her family, transforming them into spaces that reflected her own tastes and interests. The master bedroom became a reading room filled with plants and comfortable chairs. The children's rooms were converted into a craft room and a guest bedroom for the friends she was finally free to invite over. Margaret's days were filled with activities that brought her joy rather than obligation. She expanded her volunteer work at the community garden, becoming a mentor to other elderly residents who needed support navigating their own family challenges. Her story, shared carefully and with compassion, helped other seniors recognize their own worth and establish healthy boundaries with adult children who had lost sight of respect and gratitude. The local senior center asked her to lead a workshop on financial literacy for older adults, drawing on her experience of recognizing when generosity becomes exploitation. Her sessions were popular and well-attended, filled with people who needed to hear that their value wasn't measured by what they could provide to others. Margaret also reconnected with old friends from her working days, relationships that had been neglected during the years when her family consumed all her time and energy. She joined a book club, took up watercolor painting, and even started dating a kind widower she met at the community center. For the first time in decades, her life belonged to her. The financial impact of her decision had been overwhelmingly positive. Without supporting 4 additional people, Margaret's modest income stretched comfortably to cover her needs. She was able to put money back into savings, make improvements to her home, and even take a long overdue vacation to visit her sister in California. As for her family, the lessons of consequence continued to unfold. David and Linda eventually found a small apartment they could afford, but the adjustment was difficult. Without Margaret's free childcare, Linda had to reduce her work hours, which strained their budget further. The children struggled with the transition, going from a spacious house with a grandmother who catered to their needs to a cramped apartment with stressed parents who were suddenly responsible for all the household tasks Margaret had handled. The marriage, which had been sustained in part by the comfortable lifestyle Margaret's generosity had provided, began showing signs of serious strain. Without an external target for their frustrations, David and Linda's relationship dynamics became more apparent. Linda's entitled attitude, which had been directed at Margaret, now turned toward David, creating conflict that had previously been deflected onto an easier target. David attempted to reach out to his mother several times, but Margaret maintained firm boundaries. She was willing to have limited contact, but only if it was based on genuine respect rather than need. She made it clear that any relationship moving forward would be on her terms, built on mutual respect rather than obligation. "I'm not angry anymore," she told David during one of their careful phone conversations. "But I'm also not available to be taken advantage of again. If you want a relationship with me, it needs to be because you value me as a person, not because you need something from me." The grandchildren, perhaps the most affected by the dramatic change in their circumstances, slowly began to understand the lessons their parents had failed to learn. Kevin, now working a part-time job to help with family expenses, began to appreciate the concept of contribution and responsibility. Sarah, missing her grandmother's wisdom and kindness, started writing letters of genuine appreciation and reflection. Margaret read these letters with a mixture of sadness and hope. She loved her grandchildren dearly, but she recognized that allowing them to grow up without understanding respect and gratitude would have been a disservice to them as much as to herself. On a quiet evening exactly 1 year after she had served the eviction notice, Margaret sat in her garden with a cup of tea and reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place. The roses were blooming magnificently, the vegetables were thriving, and the peace she felt was deep and genuine. Her phone rang, and she saw David's number on the screen. She answered, as she had begun doing occasionally in recent months. "Hi, Mom." David's voice was different now, humbler, more genuine. "I just wanted to call and say thank you." "Thank you for what, David?" "For teaching us what we should have learned years ago. For showing us that respect isn't optional, even in families. For refusing to let us continue treating you badly." His voice was thick with emotion. "I'm sorry it took losing you for us to understand what we had." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of healing rather than pain. "I'm glad you understand now, son. But I didn't do this to teach you a lesson. I did it to save myself." "I know," David replied. "And I'm grateful you did. We all needed to learn how to stand on our own, and you needed to remember your own worth. I just hope someday we can have a real relationship again. One based on who we are, not what we can do for each other." As Margaret ended the call, she looked around her garden and felt a deep sense of completeness. She had learned that being called useless by people who depended on her wasn't a reflection of her worth. It was a reflection of their character. By choosing dignity over dysfunction, by valuing herself enough to demand respect, she had not only reclaimed her property, but reclaimed her life. The woman who had once been dismissed as useless had proven herself to be the most valuable person of all, someone who knew her own worth and refused to accept anything less than the respect she deserved. In a world that often expects older adults to quietly accept whatever treatment they receive from family, Margaret had shown that love without respect is not love at all, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse, to accept the unacceptable. Her story became a quiet inspiration in her community, a reminder that it's never too late to choose dignity, never too late to demand respect, and never too late to discover that the person you've been waiting for, someone else to value, has been you all along.